My fiancée cheated with my best friend. 15 years later she returned, so I gave her what she deserved. Some things, only when everything falls apart do you realize how long you've been living in an illusion. I'm 38 years old now, a freelance architect who thought he'd left the past buried deep enough that it could never resurface. But 15 years later, a single text message proved me wrong. I used to believe in forever. Back in college, I was that guy who planned everything down to the smallest detail. The engagement ring hidden in my sock drawer for 6 months, the weekend trips to look at apartments we'd share after graduation, the way I'd already started sketching our future home with 2 kids' bedrooms and a large kitchen where she'd bake those chocolate chip cookies I loved. She was everything I thought I wanted in a partner. Smart enough to challenge me in debates that lasted until 3 in the morning. Beautiful in that effortless way that made other guys stare when we walked across campus together. Gentle enough to calm me down when I stressed about final projects. Everyone said we were the perfect couple. Even her parents had started hinting about grandchildren. I remember the exact moment I knew I wanted to marry her. We were sitting in the library during finals week, both exhausted and surrounded by textbooks and empty coffee cups. She looked up from her psychology notes, saw me watching her, and smiled that private smile she saved just for me. "What?" she whispered, and I almost said it right then, that I loved her more than I thought possible, that I wanted to spend every library session for the rest of my life with her. Instead, I just shook my head and went back to my architectural drawings, already planning how I'd propose after graduation. The ring cost me 3 months of my part-time job at the campus bookstore. A simple solitaire, nothing flashy, because she'd always said she preferred understated elegance. I carried it everywhere for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. Looking back, maybe that should have been my first clue that something was wrong. How she started being too busy for our usual Friday night dinners, how she'd check her phone constantly when we were together, how she'd sometimes look at me with this strange expression I couldn't quite read. Looking back now, the warning signs were like whispers in a crowded room, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, which I wasn't. The shift happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, like watching someone fall asleep. One day she was the same girl who used to text me good morning before her 8 a.m. psychology class. And the next, she was this distant stranger who had mysterious commitments that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Our traditional Saturday morning brunches at the campus cafe suddenly became impossible because of urgent study sessions with classmates, whose names I'd never heard her mention in 3 years of dating. "It's for Professor Martinez's advanced theories class," she'd explain, already grabbing her jacket and avoiding eye contact. "You wouldn't know these people. They're in my major." When I offered to drive her or suggested we all study together, she'd shake her head quickly, almost panicked. "No, it's better if I go alone. You'd just be bored anyway." The most unsettling part was how she'd return from these alleged study marathons. She'd slip back into her dorm room well past midnight, claiming they'd lost track of time discussing Freudian psychology or cognitive behavioral therapy. But there was something off about the whole picture. Her hair would be slightly messed, not in the way it got when she'd been hunched over textbooks for hours, but disheveled in a way that suggested entirely different activities. And then there was the cologne. A sharp, expensive scent that definitely wasn't mine and definitely wasn't something you'd encounter in the psychology building's musty study rooms. Whenever I tried to steer our conversations toward the future we'd been planning so carefully, toward the apartment we'd talked about, renting after graduation or the road trip we'd mapped out for the summer, she'd get this trapped look in her eyes. "Let's just focus on getting through finals first," became her standard response, delivered with a forced smile that never quite reached her eyes. "We can talk about all that stuff later, when we're not so stressed about everything." I kept telling myself it was normal senior year behavior. Everyone I knew was acting strange. My roommate Jake was having daily panic attacks about his job prospects. My study partner from structural engineering was pulling all-nighters and living on energy drinks and determination. The whole campus felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. Graduation was supposed to be this exciting milestone, but instead it felt like we were all just trying to survive until May. So when the girl I loved started acting like a stranger, I convinced myself it was just another casualty of academic stress and pre-graduation anxiety. But then came that Friday night in March. I'd planned to take her to that little Italian restaurant off campus, the one where we'd had our first real date. I was going to propose right there over tiramisu, just like I'd been rehearsing for months. I even had our friends secretly positioned at nearby tables to capture the moment. Instead, I spent 20 minutes standing outside her sorority house, calling a phone that went straight to voicemail. I decided to surprise her. Maybe she'd forgotten. Maybe she was stressed about her thesis defense. I drove to the party house where I knew some of her sorority sisters were hosting a mixer with one of the fraternities. The music was loud enough to hear from the street. and the front door was propped open with a beer bottle. I walked in looking for her, navigating through crowds of drunk college students dancing to music that was too loud and drinking beer from red plastic cups. I found her in the back bedroom. Not alone. Not by a long shot. She was with 3 different guys I recognized, including my roommate Jake and my study partner from structural engineering class. The details of what I saw are burned into my memory, but I won't subject myself to reliving them by describing the scene. What I will say is that the woman I thought I knew, the woman I'd been planning to spend my life with, was someone completely different behind closed doors. She saw me standing in the doorway. For just a moment, her eyes met mine, and I saw something there that chilled me more than the betrayal itself. Relief. Like she'd been waiting for me to find out. Like this was exactly what she wanted to happen. I didn't make a scene. I didn't yell or demand explanations. I just turned around and walked out of that house, got in my car, and drove back to my apartment. I sat on my couch until sunrise, staring at that engagement ring, trying to understand how I'd gotten everything so wrong. She didn't call that night, or the next day, or the day after that. When she finally showed up at my apartment the following Tuesday, she had her story ready. It wasn't what I expected. I thought she'd cry, apologize, beg for forgiveness. Instead, she stood in my doorway with her arms crossed and told me she'd been trying to figure out how to break up with me for months. "My friends have been telling me for a year that you're not right for me," she said, like she was reading from a script. "They said you'd probably cheat on me eventually anyway, so I figured I'd beat you to it. At least this way, I'm in control." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "So you cheated on me because your friends thought I might cheat on you someday?" "It's not that simple," she said, but wouldn't meet my eyes. "Look, we're both graduating soon. We're going to different cities, different lives. This was always going to end. I just made it easier." Easier? I held up the ring box I'd been carrying around for months. "I was going to propose to you that night." For the first time, she looked genuinely shocked. Her composure cracked just enough for me to see something that might have been regret flash across her face. But then she straightened up again, and that cold mask slipped back into place. "Well, then I guess I saved us both from making a huge mistake." She left that day, and I didn't see her again before graduation. I heard through mutual friends that she'd started dating someone new immediately, an older guy, 28 or 22, who worked in finance and drove a BMW. Someone with stability and prospects, according to the gossip. Someone her parents approved of. Someone her friends thought was much better suited for her. I threw myself into work after graduation, taking every project I could get, moving to different cities, building a career that kept me too busy to think about relationships for longer than a few months. At a time, I convinced myself I was better off alone, that I'd dodged a bullet, that someone who could betray trust so easily wasn't worth the pain I was feeling. Over the years, I'd hear updates through the social media posts of mutual friends. She'd gotten engaged to the finance guy within a year of our breakup. Big wedding, expensive dress, honeymoon in Europe. They'd bought a house in the suburbs. Had their first child 2 years later, then 2 more in quick succession. From the outside, it looked like she'd gotten exactly what she wanted. The stable, successful husband, the perfect family, the life her friends had convinced her she deserved. I dated other people, had relationships that lasted anywhere from a few months to 2 years, but I never quite managed to trust anyone the way I'd trusted her. There was always a part of me holding back, waiting for the other shoe to drop, expecting betrayal around every corner. My therapist called it trust issues stemming from formative romantic trauma. I called it learning from experience. 15 years passed. I'd built a successful architectural firm, owned a house I designed myself, had a life that was comfortable and predictable and safe. I'd convinced myself I was content being alone, that I didn't need the complications that came with letting someone else into my carefully controlled world. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in October while I was reviewing blueprints for a new office building, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Hi. I know this is completely out of the blue and you probably don't want to hear from me, but I really need to talk to you. It's me." I stared at the message for a full minute before it clicked. The only person who had ever signed a text with just "it's me" and expected me to know who they meant was her. My first instinct was to delete the message and block the number. I'd spent 15 years building a life that didn't include her, and I wasn't interested in letting her back in, even peripherally. But something made me hesitate. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the part of me that had never quite gotten closure on what happened between us. 3 more messages came in rapid succession. "I know you hate me. I know I don't deserve to ask you for anything. But I'm in a really bad place right now, and I don't have anyone else to turn to. Please, just one conversation. I need to explain some things." I set the phone down and tried to focus on my work, but the messages kept pulling at my attention. What could she possibly want to explain after 15 years? What kind of bad place was bad enough to make her reach out to someone she'd betrayed so thoroughly? Against my better judgment, I typed back, "Explain what?" Her response came immediately, like she'd been sitting there waiting for me to reply. Everything. Why I did what I did. Why I made the choices I made. Why I'm texting you now instead of living happily ever after with the man I chose over you. That last line hit me harder than I expected. I found myself typing before I could stop myself. What happened to your perfect life? Can we meet somewhere? I can't explain everything over text, please. I know I don't have the right to ask, but I'm begging you. I should have said no. I should have blocked her number and gone back to my blueprints and my safe, predictable life. Instead, I found myself agreeing to meet her at a coffee shop downtown the next evening. I spent the next 24 hours alternating between regretting my decision and trying to imagine what she might look like after 15 years. The girl I'd known had been 22, fresh-faced and confident in that way only college students can be. Now she'd be 36, with 3 kids and 15 years of marriage behind her. Would she look the same? Would I still feel that familiar tug of attraction that had gotten me into trouble in the first place? When I walked into the coffee shop, I recognized her immediately, but she looked nothing like the woman I remembered. Gone was the confidence, the easy smile, the way she used to light up a room just by walking into it. The woman sitting in the corner booth looked exhausted, older than her years, with dark circles under her eyes and an anxious energy that made her fidget with her coffee cup. She looked up when I approached the table, and for a moment neither of us said anything. I sat down across from her, noting how she wouldn't quite meet my eyes. "Thank you for coming," she said finally. "I wasn't sure you would." I wasn't sure I would either. I signaled the waitress for coffee, more to give myself something to do with my hands than because I actually wanted caffeine. "So, 15 years. How have you been?" She let out a laugh that had no humor in it. "That's a loaded question. Start wherever you want." She took a deep breath, and for the first time since I'd sat down, she looked directly at me. "He left me 3 months ago. For a 23-year-old Swedish girl he met at a conference. He moved in with her last week. The divorce papers came yesterday." I felt a complicated mix of emotions: surprise, a petty satisfaction that her perfect marriage hadn't been so perfect after all, and something that might have been sympathy. "I'm sorry, that must be difficult." 3 kids, she continued, like she hadn't heard me, ages 12, 10, and 8. He wants weekend visitation and to pay the minimum child support required by law. Turns out the stable, successful husband wasn't so stable after all. "What about your friends? The ones who convinced you he was such a catch?" Her smile was bitter. "Funny thing about friends who judge people based on their bank accounts, they tend to disappear when the money does. Turns out he'd been having affairs for years. Everyone knew except me. Or maybe they knew and just didn't think I deserved to know. Either way, I'm pretty much on my own now." I sipped my coffee and tried to process what she was telling me. Part of me wanted to point out the irony, that the man she'd chosen for his supposed loyalty had turned out to be a serial cheater. But there was something in her voice, a genuine pain that made me keep the sarcasm to myself. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked instead. "Because I owe you an apology, a real one. Not the half-hearted excuse I gave you 15 years ago." "Okay, I'm listening." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was scared. Of you, of how much I loved you, of how sure you were about our future together. My friends kept telling me that guys like you always leave eventually, that I was just a college fling to you, that I'd be stupid to turn down someone like him for someone like you. Someone like me, someone who didn't have a trust fund or a guaranteed job at Daddy's firm, someone who actually had to work for what he wanted." She shook her head. "I know how that sounds. I know how shallow and awful it makes me look. It makes you look like someone who listened to the wrong people." I panicked, she continued. "The closer we got to graduation, the more real it all became, and I convinced myself that if I could make you hate me, it would be easier. For both of us." I stared at her across the table, trying to reconcile this explanation with the memory I'd carried for 15 years. "So you cheated on me to make me hate you. I thought if you caught me, you'd be disgusted and walk away, and then I could tell myself that you never really loved me anyway. That I'd made the right choice. That's the most twisted logic I've ever heard." I know. Tears were starting to form in her eyes. "I know it doesn't make sense. I know it was cruel and stupid and the worst thing I could have done to someone who loved me. But I was 22 and scared and listening to people who didn't have my best interests at heart." We sat in silence for a few minutes. I found myself studying her face, looking for traces of the girl I'd once loved. She was still beautiful, but it was a tired, worn-down kind of beautiful. The kind that came from years of compromising yourself for other people's expectations. "What do you want from me?" I asked finally. "I don't know," she admitted. "When I sent that first text, I was hoping— God, this is going to sound pathetic. I was hoping maybe we could try again. Maybe 15 years was long enough for you to forgive me." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Try again. I know it's a lot to ask. I know I hurt you terribly. But I've learned so much about myself over the years, about what really matters. And I keep thinking about how good we were together, how right it felt when we were happy. Before you sabotaged it— Yes, before I sabotaged it. She reached across the table like she was going to take my hand, then seemed to think better of it. "I've regretted that night every day for 15 years, every single day. Even when I was trying to convince myself I was happy with him, I knew I'd made a mistake." I looked at her sitting there, vulnerable and broken, and asking for a second chance, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not sympathy, not even the satisfaction I might have expected from seeing her brought low. Just a vast, empty nothing where all my feelings for her used to live. "You know what the worst part was?" I said. "It wasn't the cheating, although that was pretty awful. It wasn't even the way you broke up with me afterward. It was knowing that you thought so little of what we had together that you were willing to throw it away based on what other people told you to do. I was young. So was I. But I never would have done that to you. Not for any reason." She was crying now, not the manipulative tears I might have expected, but genuine grief for something irretrievably lost. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I'm asking anyway, because I don't know what else to do. I have 3 kids and no husband and no friends and no family support, and I keep thinking about how different my life might have been if I'd just been brave enough to trust you. "Your life would have been completely different," I agreed, "but not because you ended up with me, because you would have learned to make decisions based on your own feelings instead of other people's opinions." I finished my coffee and stood up. She looked up at me with something like panic in her eyes. "That's it? You're just leaving? What else is there to say? You made your choice 15 years ago. You chose someone else's version of security over what we had together. You chose to believe that I would eventually hurt you instead of trusting that I loved you enough to spend my life proving otherwise. But I was wrong about all of that. I see that now." "You were wrong," I agreed. "But that doesn't undo the choice you made. And it doesn't mean I owe you a second chance just because your first choice didn't work out." I could see her realizing that this wasn't going the way she'd hoped. That I wasn't going to be her backup plan, her safety net, her second chance at happiness. "Please," she said, and her voice broke on the word. "I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking anyway. Don't you believe in forgiveness? Don't you believe people can change?" "I believe in both of those things," I said. "But I also believe in consequences, and I believe that some choices can't be undone, no matter how much we regret making them." I left money on the table for both our coffees and walked toward the door. She called my name once, but I didn't turn around. Outside the coffee shop, I sat in my car for a few minutes, waiting to feel something. Sadness, maybe, or closure, or even anger. Instead, I just felt tired. Tired of carrying around the weight of what she'd done to me. Tired of the way it had affected every relationship I'd tried to have since. Tired of the part of me that had been waiting 15 years for this exact conversation. I drove home to my house, the one I'd designed and built myself, with the large kitchen and the bedrooms that had never been filled with the children I'd once imagined having with her. I made dinner for one, like I had thousands of times before, and tried to figure out what I was feeling. It wasn't until I was getting ready for bed that it hit me. For the first time in 15 years, I felt genuinely free. Not just from her, but from the version of myself that had been defined by what she'd done to me. The man who had trusted completely and been betrayed completely. The man who had spent 15 years being afraid to trust anyone that deeply again. I realized I'd been carrying around the ghost of our relationship all this time, not because I still loved her, but because I'd never properly buried it. Tonight, sitting across from her in that coffee shop, I'd finally been able to see her clearly, not as the perfect woman I'd idealized in my memory, not as the villain who had destroyed my faith in love, but as a flawed human being who had made a terrible choice and was now living with the consequences. She'd asked if I believed people could change, and the truth was, I did. I believed she probably had changed, that she probably did regret what she'd done, that she might even be capable of being a better partner to someone than she'd been to me, but none of that meant I owed her my forgiveness, or my future. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in years. I made coffee in my large kitchen, looked out at the garden I'd planted myself, and thought about the life I'd built. It wasn't the life I'd planned at 22, but it was a good life. A life I'd chosen for myself, based on my own values and desires, not on other people's expectations or fears. I never heard from her again. I didn't block her number, but she didn't text again either. Maybe she understood finally that some doors close permanently when you walk through them the wrong way. A few months later, I started dating someone new. A woman I met at a gallery opening, someone who had her own career and her own house and her own reasons for being cautious about love. Someone who understood that trust was something you built slowly, brick by brick, day by day. Someone who would never make a decision about our relationship based on what her friends thought she should do. I didn't tell her about the coffee shop conversation for months, and when I finally did, I realized something had shifted in the way I talked about it. It wasn't the defining trauma of my romantic life anymore. It was just something that had happened to me once, a long time ago, that had taught me valuable lessons about the kind of person I wanted to be and the kind of love I was willing to accept. 15 years ago, she chose to believe that I would eventually leave her, so she left me first. Last October, she asked me to prove her wrong, to show her that some love can survive anything, even betrayal and 15 years of separation. But I'd already proven her wrong by building a life I loved, by learning to trust again, by refusing to let her poor choices define my worth or my future. I'd proven her wrong by becoming someone who could sit across from her in a coffee shop and feel nothing but pity for the chances she'd thrown away. She'd been right about one thing, though. I did leave her eventually. I left her sitting in that coffee shop, crying over choices she couldn't undo. And this time, I left for good. The difference was, this time I left by choice, my choice, based on my own values and my own understanding of what I deserved from love and life. I left because I finally understood that forgiveness doesn't require giving someone access to hurt you again. I left because I'd learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, and I was no longer afraid of either one. 15 years later, I kept the promise I'd made to that 22-year-old boy who'd carried an engagement ring around for months, dreaming of forever. I chose love, just not with her. I chose to love myself enough to walk away from someone who had proven she couldn't be trusted with my heart. I chose to love the life I'd built enough to protect it from people who might tear it down. I chose to love the possibility of real partnership enough to refuse the counterfeit version she was offering. And for the first time since that night I found her in the back bedroom of a college party, I felt like I'd made exactly the right choice.